3 days. That was all the time Wyatt Calloway had left to find a wife, and he was spending what remained of it losing $4 to a pair of jacks in the back room of the Silver Elm Saloon. "You could just marry the school teacher," Reuben Doyle said, fanning his cards close to his chest. "She's not married. She's not ugly. She teaches children their letters, which means she can at least read the will you keep waving around." "She's engaged to a preacher in Carson City," Wyatt said. "Has been for a year. I asked." "Then the widow Hartley." "60 if she's a day, Reuben." "Beggars," Otis Pruitt said, not looking up from his own cards. "Generally don't get to choose." It was the summer of 1878 in Prosperity Gulch, Nevada, and the heat came through the saloon's open windows thick as syrup, carrying dust and the smell of horse and old whiskey. Wyatt Calloway was 29 years old, sunburned across the back of his neck from 3 weeks of fence mending, and staring down the barrel of a problem no amount of card playing was going to solve. His Uncle Percival had died in March and left him the Calloway spread on one single maddening condition, written into the will by a man who apparently found humor even from beyond the grave. Wyatt would inherit the ranch, the water rights, and the good name that came with both, only if he was a married man by the 1st of August. If he was not, every acre went to his cousin Douglas, a man who had not set foot on the property in 6 years and would sell it to the first railroad speculator who waved money at him. "I don't need a school teacher or a widow," Wyatt said, throwing his cards down in disgust. "I need a miracle, and it is 3 days too late to start praying for one." That was the exact moment the saloon door opened and the noise inside dropped by half, the way it always did when something walked in that nobody expected. She stood in the doorway with the afternoon sun behind her, and even the men who had been mid-sentence found themselves without words. She wore a pale pink cheongsam, faded soft from washing and sun, the fabric catching light at the shoulders where it had been mended once, carefully, by a hand that clearly cared about the work. Her black hair was pinned back plain and practical. She did not look at the bar, did not look at the gaming tables, did not flinch at the sudden silence that had swallowed the room. She looked directly at the poker table in the back, where Wyatt Calloway sat with his losing hand still scattered in front of him, and she walked straight toward it like she had been sent there on purpose. Reuben elbowed Wyatt hard enough to rock him sideways. "That there's the widow Zhao," he murmured. "Runs the laundry in the tea house past the livery. Husband died in the Comstock cave-in last winter." Wyatt barely heard him. He was watching her cross the room, watching the way every man at the bar turned to track her and the way she did not appear to notice a single one of them, and by the time she stopped at the edge of the poker table, he had forgotten entirely that he was supposed to be worried about anything at all. "You are the man who cannot find a wife," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was steady, accented but clear, each word set down with the same precision she might have used folding linen. "I heard you say so through the window. The whole street heard you say so. Is that true, or was it only talk for your friends?" The saloon had gone dead quiet. Even the bartender had stopped polishing his glass. Wyatt cleared his throat. "It's true, ma'am. I need to be married by the 1st of August, or I lose my uncle's ranch to my cousin, and my cousin would burn the barn down for the insurance money before he'd run a single head of cattle on it." "Then I have a question for you," she said, and the whole room leaned in without meaning to. "Do you need a wife, Mr. Calloway? Or do you need a woman who signs her name on a piece of paper and asks for nothing more than that?" There was not a sound in the Silver Elm Saloon. Otis had actually set his cards face up on the table, forgetting entirely that he held a winning hand. "I don't follow," Wyatt said, though something in his chest had already started following. Fast. "I am Lian Zhao," she said. "My husband died 8 months ago in the Comstock mine, and I have run our homestead claim alone since, 320 acres past the North Fork, with a spring that has never once run dry, even in this drought. The land agent came to my door last week and told me the territory will not renew a widow's claim without a husband's signature on the papers by the end of this month, no matter how many years I have worked that ground with my own 2 hands. I do not need a husband in my bed, Mr. Calloway. I need one on a piece of paper, and I am told you need the same thing, only backwards. I propose we solve both our problems in the same church on the same afternoon and leave each other exactly as we found each other in every way that matters." Reuben let out a low whistle. Otis had entirely forgotten his cards existed. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, and what he felt was not quite what he expected to feel, standing in a saloon being proposed to by a stranger in front of half the town's card players. He felt, more than anything, the particular relief of a drowning man finding a rope, tangled up with something else he did not have a name for yet, something that had nothing to do with ranches or deadlines at all. "That is a hard bargain to argue with," he said slowly. "But I'd want to know the man's name who told you that about the widow's claim. Territory law changed 2 years back. Widows with proven improvement on the land don't need a cosigner unless somebody's trying to make it look that way." Something flickered across her face, quick and sharp, gone before it fully arrived. "His name is Silas Crane," she said. "He works for the land office, though he spends more time at the Ashford Mining Company office than he does behind his own desk." "I know Silas Crane," Wyatt said, and his jaw had gone tight in a way that made Reuben sit up straighter. "And I know the Ashford Mining Company has been trying to buy up every claim along the North Fork for 2 years, on account of there being more silver in that ground than anybody's admitted out loud. Your spring isn't just water, Mrs. Zhao. It's the only water on that whole stretch that hasn't gone dry, which makes it worth a great deal more than a homestead claim to a man like Crane." "I did not come here for a rescue," she said, and there was iron under the words, plain and immediate. "I came here for a fair trade. I can defend my own land, Mr. Calloway. I have been defending it alone for 8 months. I am only asking for a signature that the law, unjustly, requires." "I wasn't offering a rescue," Wyatt said, and meant it, and something in the way he said it made her study him a second longer than she had studied anything since walking through the door. "I was offering information, so you know exactly what kind of trouble you're marrying into alongside me. Seems only fair since you already told me mine." For the first time since she had entered the room, something close to a smile touched the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "Then we understand each other," she said. "The 1st of August, Mr. Calloway. 3 days. I will see you at the church at noon, unless you find a reason between now and then to change your mind." "I won't," he said, and she turned and walked back out into the white afternoon heat without another word, leaving the whole saloon to erupt into noise the second the door swung shut behind her. "You're going to marry a woman you've known for 4 minutes, Otis said, staring at Wyatt like he'd sprouted a second head. "I'm going to marry a woman who walked into a room full of strangers and asked a straight question instead of waiting to be asked one," Wyatt said, gathering his losing cards off the table with hands that were, he noticed, not entirely steady. "Seems like as good a reason as any I've heard." The saloon emptied out slower than usual that afternoon, men lingering over their drinks just to talk about what they had witnessed, and Reuben leaned across the poker table with the particular grin of a man who smelled a good story taking shape. "You know nothing about that woman," Reuben said. "Not where she's really from, not what her husband was like, not whether she means a word of what she just said in front of the whole town. I know she walked in here and asked me a straight question, instead of writing me a letter and waiting 3 weeks for an answer, the way courting's supposed to work in this territory," Wyatt said. "I know my uncle's ranch goes to Douglas in 3 days if I don't do something about it, and I know a woman who can hold a homestead alone through a Nevada winter isn't likely to need much handling from a husband who married her for convenience." "That's a lot of knowing for 4 minutes of acquaintance," Otis said, finally remembering his cards and folding them face down, his winning hand forgotten entirely. "Maybe so," Wyatt said, standing and settling his hat back on his head. "But I've spent 29 years waiting on a wife to fall into my lap the ordinary way, courtin' and callins and a ring bought on credit, and it never once happened. Maybe the ordinary way isn't the way that was ever going to work for me." He rode out to the North Fork that same evening, not because she had asked him to, but because Silas Crane's name had settled into his gut like a stone, and he wanted to see the land in question before he put his name on anything binding. What he found, when he crested the last ridge before the homestead came into view, was a spread of dry summer grass cut through by a narrow silver ribbon of water that ran clear and cold even in a season that had turned every other creek in the territory to cracked mud. Leanne Zhao's cabin sat modest and well kept beside it, a garden of vegetables holding on stubborn against the drought, a laundry line strung between 2 posts, and Wyatt understood, looking at it, exactly why a man like Silas Crane would want a widow gone from that particular piece of ground. She was hanging wash when he rode up, and she did not startle at the sound of hooves the way most women alone on a homestead might have. She simply turned, one hand still on the line, and watched him dismount with an expression that gave nothing away. "I came to look at the spring," Wyatt said, "not to check up on you, just to know what I'm signing my name to." "Fair," she said, and led him without another word down the slope to where the water pooled clear over smooth stone before running on toward the valley floor. "My husband found this spring the first summer we claimed the land. He said it was the reason God had brought us all the way from San Francisco to a place that otherwise looked like it hated us." "What happened to him?" Wyatt asked, gentler than he'd ask anything all day. "A support beam gave out 400 feet down in the Comstock," she said, her voice level in the way of someone who had said the sentence enough times to wear the sharpest edges off it, though not all of them. "He went to the mine because the homestead alone wasn't enough those first years, before the garden and the laundry business found their footing. I have thought, more than once, that the mountain took him, because it could not take the land instead." Wyatt said nothing to that, because there was nothing worth saying, and instead crouched at the edge of the spring and let the cold water run over his fingers, thinking of his Uncle Percival, who had died in his own bed of old age and left a ranch and a strange, stubborn condition behind him, like one final piece of advice nobody had asked for. "My uncle used to say, a man who won't work doesn't deserve land, and a man who works but has no one to work it with doesn't deserve to keep it either," Wyatt said. "I always thought that was just an old man being difficult. Sitting here, I'm starting to wonder if he had a point." "Your uncle sounds like he understood something about land that most men who own it never learn," Leanne said. "That it does not belong to whoever holds the deed. It belongs to whoever tends it." "Then it sounds like you've got more claim to 320 acres than anybody in this territory," he said. And for the second time that day, he watched something soften at the edges of her carefully guarded face. She led him back up toward the cabin, and along the way she pointed out the fence posts her husband had set the first autumn, the tool shed she had reinforced herself over the winter, using lumber she had hauled 2 miles by hand, because the freighter charged more than she could spare, and the garden rows planted in the exact pattern her mother had taught her in San Francisco before the family ever thought of coming east. Wyatt listened more than he spoke, and found that he did not mind the quiet of it, the way some men might have. There was a comfort in walking beside someone who did not feel the need to fill every silence with talk. "Your English is very good," he said at one point, immediately regretting how clumsy the observation sounded once it left his mouth. "I have had 8 years to practice it," she said, without offense, though a dry note crept into her voice. "My husband spoke it worse than I do, and prouder of every mistake than most men are of their successes. He used to say a man who is not willing to sound foolish learning something new will never learn anything worth having." Sounds like he was a wise man. "He was a stubborn man," she said, which in this territory amounts to nearly the same thing. They stood a while longer at the top of the rise where the cabin came fully into view, the evening light turning the dry grass gold, and Wyatt found himself in no particular hurry to mount up and ride back to town, a feeling he could not remember having in a long while. They rode back to town separately, by unspoken agreement, but Wyatt found himself thinking about the spring, and the woman who had defended it alone for 8 months, all the way back to the Calloway ranch, long after her cabin had disappeared behind the ridge. The trouble arrived the very next morning, before either of them had a chance to breathe easy about the arrangement they had struck. Wyatt rode into town for supplies, and found Silas Crane waiting outside the general store, a thin man in a clean gray suit that never seemed to gather trail dust the way honest clothing did, his smile arriving a full second before anything in his eyes agreed to it. "Mr. Calloway," Crane said, "word travels fast in a small town. I hear you're set to marry the widow Zow at the church tomorrow." "Word travels fast," Wyatt agreed, not stopping to give the man more of his time than necessary. "You understand, of course, that the territory's homestead office has some discretion in these matters," Crane said, falling into step beside him anyway. "A widow's claim is a delicate thing. Complications can arise. Paperwork can be lost. Surveys can be disputed. It would be a shame for a man to marry into a piece of land only to watch it slip away in the courts a month later over some technicality nobody thought to check." Wyatt stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Are you threatening the woman I'm about to marry, Mr. Crane? Or are you just talking to hear the sound of your own voice?" "I never threaten anyone," Crane said, his smile never wavering, which was, Wyatt thought, exactly the kind of thing a man said when he meant to do precisely that. "I simply point out that the Ashford Mining Company has made a very generous offer for that parcel, an offer that would solve a great many of Mrs. Zhao's problems without requiring her to marry a stranger for a piece of paper. I would hate to see her make a hasty decision she comes to regret, especially when there are far simpler paths available to a woman in her position." "The simpler path you're describing is her losing the only water on that whole stretch of land to a mining company that wants it for the silver underneath it," Wyatt said. "I may not be the sharpest card player in Prosperity Gulch, but I can follow that particular trail just fine." Crane's smile finally faltered, just slightly, just long enough for Wyatt to see the calculation underneath it. "The wedding is tomorrow, I hear," he said instead, his voice gone thinner. "A great deal can happen between now and tomorrow, Mr. Calloway. I'd think carefully before I made myself an obstacle to a company with the Ashford name behind it." He walked away without waiting for a reply, and Wyatt stood in the dusty street for a long moment, feeling the particular cold that settles into a man's chest when he understands, all at once, that the fight in front of him is bigger than he first believed. He rode straight for the North Fork that afternoon and found Leanne standing in her garden, and the look on his face must have told her something was wrong before he said a single word. "Crane cornered me in town," Wyatt said. "He's threatening to tie up your claim in the courts, or worse, unless you sell to Ashford Mining before the wedding happens. I don't think this was ever about a cosigner requirement, Leanne. I think it was always about getting you scared enough to sell that land cheap before anyone thought to check the law properly." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands still in the dirt, and when she finally spoke, her voice had a hardness in it he had not heard before. My husband spent 3 years proving up this claim before the mine took him. I have spent 8 months more proving it alone, through a winter that nearly broke me and a spring that nearly starved me before the garden came in. I did not survive all of that to hand it to a man in a clean suit because he is frightened of what a widow and a rancher standing together might accomplish. Then we don't hand it to him, Wyatt said. No, she agreed. We do not. That evening, working by lamplight at her kitchen table, they went through every scrap of paper her husband had left behind. The original claim filing, the survey markers, the 2 years of tax receipts that proved continuous residence and improvement exactly as the Homestead Act required. And Wyatt realized, sometime past midnight, that he had stopped thinking about the marriage as a bargain to save his ranch and started thinking about it as something else entirely, something he did not yet have the courage to name out loud. You didn't have to help me search through all this tonight, Leanne said, watching him across the lamplight, papers spread between them like a battlefield map. Your part of our arrangement was finished the moment you agreed to sign at the church. Maybe I didn't come out here because of the arrangement, Wyatt said, and the words surprised him even as he said them, honest in a way he had not planned on being. Maybe I came out here because watching you defend this place with nothing but paperwork and stubbornness is the most impressive thing I've seen a person do in a long while, and I wanted to see if I could be some use to it. She looked at him across the table for a long moment, the lamp throwing soft gold light across the careful mending at her shoulder, and something in her guarded expression finally, quietly, gave way. My husband used to say I argued like I had a law degree and a grudge in equal measure, she said. I have not had reason to laugh about that in a long while. I'd like to hear you laugh about it again sometime, Wyatt said, and meant it more than he had meant almost anything in his life. And for a moment, neither of them said a word, the lamp between them burning low and steady, while outside the crickets filled the dark with their endless summer noise. May I ask you something? Leanne said, after the quiet had stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of conversation, and expect an honest answer instead of a polite one? You can ask. Are you afraid of losing the ranch, or are you afraid of what it means about you if you lose it? Your uncle's condition was cruel in its way, but it was also a kind of test, and I wonder which part of the test frightens you more. Wyatt sat with that question longer than he expected to need. I think I'm afraid Douglas is right about me, he admitted finally. He's always said I'm a man who drifts, who never chose anything hard enough to keep it. Maybe part of me has been waiting these 3 days to see if I'd let this slip away too, the same as everything else I've never fought hard for. You rode 2 hours out here tonight to search through 8 months of another person's paperwork by lamplight, Leanne said. That is not a man who lets things slip away without a fight. I have watched men drift, Mr. Calloway. You are not one of them. Something eased in his chest at that, a tightness he had been carrying so long he had stopped noticing its weight, and he looked at her across the low lamp flame with a gratitude he did not entirely know how to voice. The morning of the wedding brought trouble before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Wyatt rode into town to find a stranger's wagon parked outside the land office, and inside, going over papers with a clerk who looked deeply uncomfortable, sat a man introduced to him as Mr. Ashford himself, down from Virginia City to settle the matter of the North Fork claim personally. Mr. Calloway, Ashford said, not rising from his chair, a heavy-set man with a watch chain thick as rope and the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. I understand you intend to marry into a land dispute today. I'll save you the trouble. My company is prepared to offer Mrs. Zhao 4 times the government valuation of that claim, cash in hand, by sundown. That kind of money would set a woman up comfortably anywhere in this territory. Seems a poor trade to marry a stranger for land that could simply be sold outright." "Funny thing about that," Wyatt said. "Widows with a proven claim under the Homestead Act don't need a husband's signature to hold their land. That law changed 2 years back. Your man Crane has been telling Mrs. Zhao otherwise, which sounds a great deal like a man deliberately misinforming a woman about her own legal rights so his employer could buy her land cheap out of fear." The clerk behind the desk went very still. Ashford's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes recalculated fast. "That would be a serious accusation," Ashford said. "It would be," Wyatt agreed. "Good thing I'm not the one making it official. That'll be the Territorial Land Commissioner once Mrs. Zhao files a formal complaint this afternoon, backed up by every tax receipt and survey marker proving 8 months of continuous, uncontested residence on that claim. I imagine a company with the Ashford name attached wouldn't want its dealings with widows examined too closely by the territorial government, especially not the week before an election year." For the first time since Wyatt had walked in, Ashford's composure cracked. Thin but visible, a man doing rapid arithmetic on how much a scandal would cost against how much silver sat under one stubborn widow's spring. "There is no need for accusations or complaints," he said finally, his voice gone careful. "I am certain Mr. Crane misunderstood the current state of the law. My company has no interest in disputes with legitimate claim holders. Mrs. Zhao's land is, of course, entirely her own to keep or sell as she wishes." "Glad we understand each other," Wyatt said, and walked out of that office with his heart hammering harder than it had at any poker table in his life, because he had just bluffed a mining magnate with nothing but a piece of law he was 90% certain he remembered correctly. And it had worked. He found Leanne waiting at the edge of town an hour later, dressed in the same pale pink cheongsam from the saloon, mended shoulder and all, and when he told her what had happened at the land office, her hand came up to cover her mouth, disbelief and relief moving across her face in equal measure. "You did that for me," she said, "before we had even said our vows." "I did that because it was right," Wyatt said, "and because somewhere between last night's lamplight and this morning, I stopped thinking of this marriage as 2 people solving separate problems, and started thinking of it as something I actually wanted, paperwork or not." She was quiet for a long moment, the summer wind pulling at the loose strands of her hair, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost every ounce of its careful guard. "I came to that saloon 3 days ago looking for a signature," she said. "I did not expect to find a man willing to stand between me and a mining company before he had any promise from me at all. I think, Mr. Calloway, that I would like to marry you today, for reasons that have nothing to do with paperwork either." The church in Prosperity Gulch was small, whitewashed, and full by noon, half the town having heard some version of the saloon proposal, and none of them willing to miss whatever came next. Reuben stood as Wyatt's witness, grinning like a man who had won the biggest hand of his life without playing a single card, and Otis had somehow talked his way into ringing the church bell twice as loud as necessary. Leanne walked down the short aisle in her pale pink cheongsam, and Wyatt thought, watching her come toward him in the dusty afternoon light, that he had never in his life seen anyone walk toward anything with that much quiet certainty. The preacher spoke the old familiar words, and when he asked if anyone present had cause why these 2 should not be joined, the whole church went silent for a beat too long, everyone remembering Silas Crane, before Reuben, unable to help himself, called out from the front pew that the only objection anybody had was that the ceremony wasn't moving fast enough. The church erupted in laughter, and Leanne laughed too, open and unguarded, in a way Wyatt suspected she had not laughed in a very long time, and he decided right then that he intended to hear that sound as often as he possibly could for the rest of his life. They were married before the sun had moved another hand's width across the sky, and outside the church, in front of half the town, Wyatt Calloway kissed his wife for the first time and felt the whole complicated architecture of the last 3 days settle, finally, into something that made simple, uncomplicated sense. 3 months later, the North Fork Spring still ran clear and cold, and the Calloway Ranch, now grown by 320 acres of proven homestead claim, had weathered the worst drought Prosperity Gulch had seen in a decade without losing a single head of cattle, thanks to water that never once ran dry. Leanne's laundry and tea house had expanded into a small building near the livery with a hand-painted sign that read, "Zal and Calloway," and half the ranch hands in the territory had taken to stopping there for tea before riding out on the long circuit, drawn as much by her steady company as by the drink itself. Silas Crane had left the territory entirely by September. His employment with the land office quietly ended after the commissioner's office received a complaint, thorough and well documented, describing exactly how a widow had nearly lost her legal claim to deliberate misinformation. On the evening of the first frost, Wyatt found Leanne standing at the edge of the spring where he had first crouched to test the water with his own hands, and he came to stand beside her, watching the last color drain out of the western sky. "My husband said this spring was the reason God brought us here," she said. "I used to think he meant the water alone. I think now he meant something bigger than that." "Might be he was right on both counts," Wyatt said, and took her hand, calloused and steady, exactly the kind of hand a person could hold through every hard season a life had left to offer. Reuben had taken to riding out most Sundays for supper, claiming it was for the company, though everyone in town understood well enough it was for the dumplings Leanne made from a recipe her mother had carried from Canton, a dish that had, by autumn, become something of a small legend among the ranch hands who worked the North Fork. Otis had started courting the school teacher's cousin down from Carson City, a development he attributed, with a straight face, entirely to having watched Wyatt take a chance on something uncertain and come out the better for it. Even Ashford's silence proved permanent. No further agents came asking after the spring, and the tax receipts filed that autumn under both their names went through the land office without a single objection raised. "Douglas rode through town last week," Wyatt told her one evening, as they walked the fence line together in the long gold light before supper. "Didn't stop to say a word to me. Just looked at the herd, looked at the water, and turned his horse back toward the county road." "Are you sorry for him?" Leanne asked. "A little," Wyatt admitted, "but not enough to have done anything differently." She smiled at that, the same unguarded smile he had first seen outside the church, and slipped her hand into his as they walked. Two people who had started as a bargain struck across a poker table and become, somewhere in the space of a single dry summer, something neither of them had thought to look for, and both of them had been fortunate enough to find anyway. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.